Deep in the American wilderness, where ancient forests swallow the light and old folklore breathes between the trees, some hikers never find their way back. The incident that nearly claimed my life occurred in the dense forests of Washington state. I was 17 years old at the time, young and foolishly confident in my understanding of the natural world. This happened back in 2018, though the memories remain as vivid as yesterday's sunrise. I was visiting my grandparents for what we called my summer staycation, a tradition spanning back to my childhood. I was born and raised in Washington, in the small town of Newport near the Idaho border. My grandparents lived south of us in an even smaller community, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests north of Spokane. When I turned 8, my parents relocated our family to Newport Beach, California. Yes, from Newport to Newport Beach, a coincidence that became our family's running joke. Unlike my siblings who embraced coastal living, I yearned for the rugged wilderness of my birthplace. The ocean was beautiful, but it couldn't replace the towering pines and hidden valleys of rural Washington. So each summer, while my siblings lounged on sandy beaches, I returned to my grandparents' farm. Their property was substantial, 297 acres of diverse terrain that sustained multiple crops and livestock. 60 acres were dedicated to alfalfa, another 47 to commercial dent corn, 70 for gala apple orchards, and 30 for Vidalia onions. They also raised about 400 sheep and 7 cows that roamed the remaining acreage of forested hills and rocky terrain. The livestock served multiple purposes, with sheep grazing beneath apple trees, keeping vegetation manageable while feasting on fallen fruit. When curious neighbors asked why my grandparents diversified their farming operations, their explanation was straightforward. Experience had taught them harsh lessons about agricultural vulnerability. A single disastrous potato season had nearly bankrupted them decades earlier, and they swore never to depend on a single crop again. My education on the farm grew more advanced with each passing summer. My grandparents patiently taught me to operate increasingly complex equipment: tractors, harvesters, and utility vehicles that traversed the varied landscape. The exhilaration of driving tractors and ATVs across open fields became the highlight of my visits. Though most planting concluded before my arrival, there was never a shortage of tasks. By midsummer, we'd harvest the first alfalfa cutting, and I'd work through the night, watching nocturnal wildlife emerge from forest edges to investigate our mechanical intrusion. The farm's boundaries touched wilderness, and I grew accustomed to seeing deer, elk, moose, and occasionally predators like mountain lions or bears. Wolves maintained a ghostly presence, their howls echoing through valleys while their physical forms remained elusive shadows glimpsed at great distances. Beyond my grandparents, about 10 seasonal workers helped manage the farm's operations. These men knew the land intimately, having worked it for years. Yet for all my familiarity with local wildlife, there remained gaps in my knowledge. The surrounding communities occasionally referenced cryptids with skepticism, or as fodder for campfire stories told to frightened teenagers. Bigfoot received occasional mention, though always with a knowing wink or dismissive laugh. The wilderness held secrets, certainly, but none we believed could truly threaten us. The summer of 2018 marked a significant transition in my life. After years of pleading, my parents finally relented to my request to complete my senior year in Washington. The prospect of returning permanently filled me with excitement, though I couldn't have imagined the horror awaiting me before the school year would begin. Agricultural life follows natural rhythms dictated by crop cycles. Alfalfa requires multiple cuttings throughout the season. Corn harvest depends on moisture content, typically occurring between September and late October. Onions come out of the ground in late August through early September. Apple harvest proves most labor-intensive, requiring both mechanical assistance and significant human effort. My grandparents hired local high school students during this period, paying by the bushel to incentivize efficient work. It was during this transitional period between apple and corn harvest when the incident occurred. The day began unremarkably. The eastern sky barely showed hints of dawn when one of the workers discovered the damaged fence near the apple orchard's eastern boundary. A substantial section had been knocked down, not cut or broken by normal wear, but forcefully collapsed as though something massive had pushed through. More concerning than the structural damage was the livestock situation. Most of the sheep had wandered beyond the property line. My grandfather gathered several workers and me to track down the animals before they dispersed completely. We quickly retrieved our ATVs from the equipment shed and set out in search patterns. "Keep your eyes on the ground," my grandfather instructed, his weathered face creased with concern. "Look for hoof prints, droppings, or wool caught on branches. They couldn't have gone too far since last night's check." Several friends joined the search, and we worked systematically through the morning hours. By mid-afternoon we had located and returned most of the flock, leaving only 6 unaccounted for. My friends needed to leave for other commitments, but my grandfather pulled me aside before I could join them. "We need those last 6 back before nightfall," he said firmly. "Predators get bold after dark, and those sheep represent a significant investment." I nodded, understanding both the financial and ethical responsibility of protecting the animals in our care. After grabbing a quick meal, I headed back out alone, this time taking the 3-wheeler since all 4-wheelers were occupied with Apple trailer transportation. The older 3-wheeler held a special place in my heart despite its mechanical quirks. Unlike newer models with built-in speed governors, this machine could achieve impressive velocity across open terrain, though finding replacement parts proved increasingly difficult as the model aged. I directed my search toward the eastern property line, a rugged section dominated by forest and rocky hills near the Idaho border. The landscape there shifted dramatically from the cultivated fields, untamed and forbidding even in daylight. The southern and eastern boundaries consisted primarily of these unwelcoming features, making them the least desirable portions of the farm. Mental mapping placed the southern fence line as belonging to the neighboring property owned by the Rodriguez family. They cultivated wheat and alfalfa, their boundary continuing westward until it met Amish-owned farmland. The northern boundary followed a main access road shared by all adjacent properties. Beginning at the location where we'd recovered sheep earlier, I struggled to determine where the remaining animals might have wandered. Visibility proved limited from ground level, so I navigated to a hilltop for a better vantage point. The elevated position offered little additional insight, forcing me to think like a sheep, to consider which path would naturally appeal to the animals. The most logical route appeared to follow the hill's base, curving around toward an abandoned quarry. This presented a potential problem, as years of runoff had transformed the quarry into a marshy, unstable environment. I crossed the hilltop and halted my vehicle at the slope's edge, cutting the engine to listen for bleating or movement below. Standing at the precipice, I surveyed the landscape stretching before me. The exposed hillside featured scattered sagebrush and loose rocks, weathered by seasons of harsh elements. The rocky face displayed contrasting colors, predominantly reddish, with occasional streaks of gray where erosion had cut deeper. As evening light faded, the entire scene took on an increasingly sinister appearance. I checked my watch, 7:47 p.m. Sunset approached rapidly, and twilight would soon surrender to darkness. Logic dictated returning to the farmhouse and resuming the search with proper lighting and assistance, yet adolescent impulse overrode better judgment. Before departing, I decided to entertain myself by rolling stones down the incline. I located several basketball-sized rocks nearby and sent them tumbling, watching as they dislodged smaller shale in their path. The minor avalanches proved less spectacular than anticipated, prompting me to seek a more substantial challenge. My attention fixed on a boulder roughly equivalent to my 3-wheeler's size. Initial attempts to dislodge it proved futile, as the rock remained stubbornly embedded in surrounding soil. Needing additional leverage, I climbed uphill to snap a sturdy branch from a nearby tree. Returning to the boulder, I heard distant bleating, faint but unmistakable sheep vocalizations carrying across the stagnant air. The sounds appeared to originate from beyond the marsh, confirming my suspicions about their location, while highlighting the difficult terrain separating us. Unable to navigate the treacherous landscape with my vehicle, I decided to complete my rock-rolling experiment before retrieving a truck better suited for the recovery operation. I wedged the branch beneath the boulder at various angles, gradually increasing pressure until the massive stone tilted and broke free. The rock's descent exceeded my expectations, thundering downslope with increasing momentum while triggering a cascade of smaller debris in its wake. The landslide generated surprising volume, echoing across the valley. As the boulder approached the bottom, something unexpected caught my attention, a dark shape darting away from the impact zone through settling dust. I dismissed it as wildlife startled by the disturbance, likely a coyote or fox seeking evening prey. When the final stone settled at the hill's base, I returned to my three-wheeler, preparing to depart. The sheep called out again, presumably alarmed by the commotion. I turned toward the sound and shouted reassuringly, "I'll be right back," while reaching for the kickstart. Before I could engage the engine, peripheral movement registered, a grayish mass accelerating toward me with frightening velocity. Impact came without warning or opportunity for evasion. The collision launched me from the vehicle with devastating force. One moment I stood firmly on solid ground. The next reality inverted as I tumbled uncontrollably down the jagged incline. My body became entangled with something massive, its matted fur brushing against my face during our violent descent. Each rotation brought fresh agony as the slope's surface tore through my clothing. The initial impacts punctured my flannel shirt, exposing skin to abrasive rocks that carved shallow wounds across my back. Air evacuated my lungs upon first impact, leaving me gasping desperately between collisions. The entity responsible for my predicament continued rolling alongside me, its substantial mass inflicting additional damage with each point of contact. Its body radiated unnatural density and heat, while the stench of decay permeated my senses. I perceived its bulk absorbing punishment that would have otherwise shattered my bones. Sudden, stabbing pain erupted near my waist, something sharp penetrating fabric and breaking skin. The sensation registered as claws or talons, though my mind couldn't fully process the implications, as survival instinct overrode analytical thought. My descent halted with jarring abruptness as something snagged my clothing. The creature continued its downward trajectory, its substantial form tumbling beyond my position. Disoriented and trembling, I identified the intervention. A sagebrush had become entangled in my belt, arresting my momentum at a crucial moment. Below me, the unseen assailant emitted distressed vocalizations, a combination of whining and guttural noises suggesting injury. I loosened my belt to free myself from the brush, attempting to stand despite the unstable surface. My legs refused proper coordination, nerves firing erratically from shock and trauma. Small rocks embedded themselves in my knees through torn denim as I attempted crawling across the treacherous slope. Army crawling proved marginally effective, allowing incremental progress across the hillside. What felt like hours of desperate movement eventually brought me to more stable terrain where standing became possible. I scrambled toward my overturned three-wheeler, discovering gasoline leaking from the vent hole in its cap. With practiced movements born from years of experience, I righted the machine using the handlebar and rear fender as leverage points. The engine had undoubtedly flooded during the accident, requiring careful handling to avoid further complications. I held the throttle open while allowing fuel to settle properly, a necessary delay despite my desperate circumstances. During this forced pause, sounds from below captured my attention. My attacker remained alive, struggling to ascend the slope while emitting unnatural growls. The vocalizations carried qualities I couldn't reconcile with known wildlife, neither fully canine nor ursine, but something disturbingly between. "What kind of creature wouldn't give up after that?" I whispered, straining to identify the shape in growing darkness. The silhouette suggested badger-like proportions, but at an impossible scale, or perhaps a wolverine of unprecedented size. Another possibility crossed my mind. A wild boar, though the movement patterns contradicted this theory. The growls continued, blending whining with threatening snarls in an unsettling combination. Abandoning further speculation, I focused on escape. The engine finally responded to my kick, purring to life as I opened the throttle fully. Before accelerating away, I glanced backward once more and discovered the slope empty of my pursuer. Scanning frantically, I spotted movement through the marsh, a dark figure zigzagging with unnatural speed through difficult terrain. The realization struck with horrifying clarity. The creature hadn't abandoned its hunt, but was executing a flanking maneuver to intercept me. I launched the three-wheeler forward, heart hammering against my ribcage as I pushed the machine to its limits. Wind howled past my ears while I maintained approximately 40 miles per hour across uneven ground. The tree line approached rapidly, forcing me to reduce speed just enough to navigate between trunks. Turning northward toward familiar trails, I glimpsed my pursuer through peripheral vision, a dark shape moving parallel to my course, matching my pace between trees. Panic surged through my system, prompting me to veer southward while crouching low over the handlebars to minimize wind resistance. My front tire struck an unseen obstacle, violently jarring the steering column and momentarily lifting the wheel before slamming it down. The impact loosened the headlight bulb, causing it to flicker erratically like a primitive strobe, casting disorienting, intermittent illumination through the forest. Through these pulsing glimpses, I witnessed the creature darting alongside my path, its speed defying biological limitations. The forest thinned ahead, revealing open hillside, a potential advantage for my vehicle's superior straight-line velocity. Before I could capitalize on this opportunity, violent impact from my right sent the three-wheeler skidding sideways as though struck by another vehicle. Fighting for control, I barely stabilized when a second, more powerful collision spun me completely around. Instinctively engaging the brakes caused the engine to stall, plunging me into profound silence. The abrupt transition from mechanical roar to absolute quiet intensified my terror. Physical manifestations of fear overwhelmed my system, hair bristling against my sleeves, hands shaking uncontrollably, jaw muscles spasming beyond voluntary control. Then the creature materialized before my vehicle, its massive form blocking escape. In the moonlight's pale illumination, I finally observed my pursuer clearly. Initial Wolverine comparisons proved woefully inadequate. The entity resembled nothing from conventional zoology, its proportions and features suggesting something that shouldn't exist outside horror cinema. It growled with such profound bass that vibrations transmitted through my seat. When it turned toward me, eyes reflecting orange hatred in the darkness, my terror reached previously unimagined heights. Then, impossibly, it rose to stand on two legs, revealing a bipedal form that demolished any remaining rational explanations. Involuntarily retreating, I tumbled backward off the three-wheeler. The creature dropped to all fours and circled my vehicle with predatory intent. Survival instinct triggered desperate flight despite knowing outrunning it was impossible. I managed barely 3 steps before tripping and falling face first into dirt. Then came the most terrifying sensation. Fingers, actual fingers, wrapping around my left ankle with crushing pressure. Twisting to face my attacker, I witnessed the creature extending its reach without fully committing to pursuit, pulling me inexorably toward its waiting jaws. Something within me transformed, panic crystallizing into desperate rage. "You want to eat me?" I screamed, kicking wildly with my free leg, while clawing at the ground for purchase. Its mouth gaped open, revealing dentition resembling an oversized canine predator. As my foot approached its jaws, I redirected my efforts toward striking its head repeatedly with my free limb. My blows seemed ineffective, serving only to intensify its growling. Tears streamed down my face as sobs escaped between screams, the hopelessness of my situation becoming painfully apparent. My fingers encountered a fist-sized rock embedded in soil, the only potential weapon within reach. Grasping the stone, I leaned forward with every ounce of remaining strength and struck the creature's nose with maximum force. Before it could react, I jammed the rock directly into one eye socket. The response was immediate, a high-pitched yip followed by a release of my leg as it recoiled to paw at its injured face. Seizing this momentary advantage, I rolled aside and scrambled to my feet in a single fluid motion. I leaped onto the three-wheeler, kick-started the engine, and accelerated away without concern for direction or terrain. The southern fence line appeared in the distance, providing crucial orientation as I maintained parallel course through sagebrush and around larger obstacles. Engine noise obscured environmental sounds, but building structures gradually materialized ahead, the old Rodriguez barn approaching through darkness. As hope kindled within me, an inhuman roar shattered my composure, the sound reverberating through my body with physically painful intensity. The three-wheeler began jerking violently beneath me. Glancing downward revealed my pursuer's hands gripping both tires. Claws penetrating rubber with evident ease. Air escaped with audible hissing as the tires deflated. Despite revving the engine aggressively, my speed continued decreasing. The creature momentarily lost balance, providing precious seconds as I limped forward on damaged wheels. The speedometer indicated a mere 15 miles per hour as I approached the barn. Pushing the dying machine to 20, I coasted into the clearing between grain silos and the weathered structure. Before the vehicle fully stopped, I abandoned it and sprinted toward the barn's entrance, throwing my weight against the heavy door and slipping inside. Frantic fingers traced wooden surfaces in near-complete darkness, desperately seeking security. I located a familiar groove that housed a metal crossbar, sliding it firmly into position across the door. Testing the barrier with substantial pressure confirmed it would hold, at least temporarily. Overwhelming relief flooded my system as I collapsed onto the dirt floor, my body trembling uncontrollably from exertion and terror. Outside, my three-wheeler continued idling, its headlight casting erratic pulses through barred window openings resembling feeding pens. The intermittent illumination allowed brief orientation within the structure. I recognized the layout from previous visits years earlier when my grandfather and I had traded hay for livestock with the Rodriguez family. The rectangular building featured central walkways flanked by stalls, with elevated hay storage accessible via ladder. Barred windows perforated exterior walls at regular intervals, allowing ventilation while preventing livestock escape or predator entry. The physical security momentarily calmed my racing thoughts until reality reasserted itself through sound. Heavy footsteps circled outside, accompanied by deep rhythmic breathing that exceeded normal wildlife lung capacity. Metal creaked, my three-wheeler's frame protesting as something manipulated it. The engine's pitch fluctuated before the machine sailed through air, tumbling end over end like a discarded toy. After a final mechanical sputter, silence descended. In darkness now absolute, my eyes strained uselessly toward each window. Anticipation built unbearably until impact shook the entire structure. A deliberate ramming attempt against the wall. Another followed, then another, each from different positions as the creature systematically tested structural integrity. After multiple unsuccessful attempts, the assault ceased. A new sound emerged, claws methodically dragging across exterior surfaces, occasionally catching on barred windows with metallic pinging. The deliberate nature of these actions suggested disturbing intelligence. The scratching halted abruptly near my position. Despite complete darkness, I sensed its precise location through inexplicable awareness. A low snarl preceded arms reaching through bars, fingers extending inward like grotesque probes seeking contact. The creature grasped metal barriers and jerked violently, testing their anchoring. Though the bars held against initial assault, continuous pressure produced an ominous metallic whine suggesting imminent failure. When the creature paused its efforts, the silence proved more terrifying than its previous aggression. Was it planning? Calculating? The methodical clicking of nails against metal preceded a hideous, prolonged whine before the presence withdrew. Minutes stretched interminably without further sound. I consulted my watch. Barely an hour had passed since my rock-rolling experiment, though subjective experience suggested vastly longer duration. Surely my grandparents would initiate search efforts soon, though this thought offered minimal comfort given my current circumstances. Wood splintering interrupted my thoughts, not the door, but somewhere along the wall. Scratching and growling followed as the creature apparently discovered a structural weakness. Moving stall to stall in near darkness, I frantically searched for defensive implements. In one windowless enclosure, heavy breathing and scratching intensified. The predator had located a small knothole and forced its snout through the opening. Continuing my desperate inventory, I remembered my grandfather's practice of storing larger tools in overhead rafters. Looking upward, I distinguished the silhouettes of a shovel and pitchfork suspended above an adjacent stall. I quickly retrieved both and returned to confront my stalker. It had withdrawn momentarily, but immediately reinserted its muzzle upon detecting my presence. Gathering courage, I raised the pitchfork and drove it downward with maximum force against the exposed nose. The implement's tines encountered surprising resistance, failing to penetrate fully despite my desperate strength. The creature withdrew violently, slamming against the exterior wall with sufficient force to flex the entire structure without breaking through. Retreating from the stall, I observed the creature attempting to force its entire head through barred windows. Its skull barely fit between metal barriers, becoming temporarily wedged in the process. Seizing this opportunity, I grabbed the shovel and struck its exposed head with all available strength. The impact produced a resonant metallic sound but minimal apparent injury. As the creature roared and struggled to free itself, I noticed the architectural detail that might provide advantage. Wooden shutters suspended above each window, held open by simple hook-and-eye mechanisms. Using the shovel handle, I dislodged the hook holding the nearest shutter. The heavy wooden panel crashed downward, striking the creature's skull with devastating force and dislodging it from between bars. A tremendous impact followed as the creature slammed against the exterior wall, momentarily stunned but evidently not incapacitated. I hurried to secure remaining windows, dropping each protective shutter into position. In resulting darkness, the creature's rage manifested through intensified growling and renewed assault against the main entrance. Metal hinges protested against repeated impacts, their distressed tones suggesting imminent failure. Strange sounds followed, heavy objects dropping onto ground followed by shuffling movements. Curiosity overcame caution as I peered through a small gap between door panels. The creature's silhouette appeared in moonlight, apparently leaping upward repeatedly. Realization struck with horrifying clarity. It targeted the hayloft entrance, attempting to reach the pulley rope hanging from the exterior loading mechanism. Navigating through darkness toward the interior ladder, I ascended to the loft level and pushed open the access panel. Moonlight flooded the elevated space, providing significantly better visibility than the ground floor. Approaching the exterior loading door cautiously, I observed the creature's repeated attempts to capture the dangling rope. It paused, sniffing air currents before looking directly at my position with uncanny accuracy. Backing up for better visual perspective, it suddenly dropped to all fours and charged forward, leaping with extraordinary height. Its snout contacted the rope, causing it to swing pendulously. Before the predator could capitalize on this success, I lunged forward and grabbed the rope, pulling the entire pulley assembly inside. The creature responded with an enraged vocalization that penetrated my core with primordial fear. Despite overwhelming terror, anger ignited within me, a desperate determination to survive this inexplicable nightmare. Surveying available resources, I noticed several large hay bales positioned near the track system used for moving loads throughout the loft. An idea formed, perhaps not tactically sound, but born from limited options and mounting desperation. I connected the largest bale to the track using tines and block-and-tackle mechanisms, positioning it beneath the exterior hood. My plan involved swinging the massive bale outward and dropping it onto my pursuer, but the assembly's reach proved insufficient to position it properly. Lowering the bale partially, I hoped to entice the creature beneath it. Initially, the strategy appeared ineffective as the predator retreated from the suspended load. Suddenly, violent oscillations transmitted through the rope as unexpected weight pulled against my grip. Arms appeared around the bale's perimeter. The creature had leaped upward and latched onto the suspended mass. Before it could establish stable position, I released tension completely, sending both bale and beast plummeting earthward. The impact resonated through the barn's structure, a substantial thud suggesting significant force. From my elevated position, I observed no movement beneath the collapsed bale, though uncertainty remained about the creature's condition. Self-preservation prevented immediate departure, as the risk of encountering the potentially conscious predator outweighed potential escape. Looking around the loft, I identified multiple hay bales that could provide temporary shelter. Using the track system, I relocated all available bales to form a barricade across the loft opening, effectively sealing myself inside. Climbing atop the improvised fortress, I burrowed slightly downward into decomposing hay that emitted musty odors from previous moisture exposure. The aging material might mask my scent, I reasoned, while providing concealment from visual detection. Covered completely and remaining motionless, exhaustion eventually overcame hypervigilance, and unconsciousness claimed me. I awakened to faint sniffing sounds and distant rustling. Paralysis gripped me momentarily as recent events reassembled in my consciousness. Summoning tremendous willpower to move incrementally, I checked my watch. 6:07 a.m. Nearly 8 hours had passed since the initial encounter. The rustling continued rhythmically, interspersed with shallow sniffing followed by muffled sneezing. Terror resurged with crushing intensity, Forcing myself to action, I slowly rotated and crawled toward the bale's edge, dreading the possibility of making direct eye contact with the creature. Initial inspection revealed nothing below. Methodically checking each direction yielded similar results. The sounds continued, however, reminiscent of sheep nosing through hay during feeding times. A horrifying possibility materialized. Perhaps the creature had somehow accessed the loft's edge and was systematically excavating my hiding place. Lowering my head near the bale's surface, I confirmed the sounds originated nearby. Trembling intensified as another sneeze punctuated the rustling. Gradually rising to kneeling position in preparation for desperate flight, I remained hyper-aware of increasing activity below. Without warning, a head emerged from the bottom hay bale directly before me. It twisted erratically, struggling to orient itself while emitting a low, menacing growl. Acting purely on instinct, I leaped downward, landing directly on its exposed skull and snout. The creature emitted an agonized sound unlike anything in nature's repertoire. The impact destabilized me, resulting in forward momentum that positioned me directly before the predator. Its head shook violently, dislodging surrounding hay that cascaded downward like geological slides. The entire barricade began shifting, individual bales elevating slightly before explosively dispersing as the creature burst upward, howling triumphantly. Before regaining my footing, I scrambled toward the loft access door, wrenching it open and sliding onto the ladder below. The hatch closed automatically as I descended rapidly, skipping multiple rungs in my haste. Above me, claws tore at wooden barriers while structural damage accelerated. The loft door suddenly collapsed, followed by substantial impact on the floor above. Turning toward the barn's main entrance, I witnessed the creature landing on the opposite side, immediately orienting toward my position. As it advanced, my fingers located the door latch and disengaged it. Squeezing through the narrowest possible opening, I slammed the heavy panel behind me and secured the exterior crossbar. The door immediately flexed outward as tremendous force applied from within, accompanied by frustrated vocalizations. After brief silence, renewed assault threatened the door's integrity, the barrier flexing outward substantially further than previous attempts. Recognizing imminent breakthrough, I sprinted around the structure, nearly colliding with my damaged three-wheeler. The nearest alternative shelter appeared to be the grain silos positioned nearby. The first two structures lacked external access ladders, but the third featured metal rungs ascending to its summit. As I reached the base and began climbing, the barn door crashed inward behind me. By the time I neared the ladder's midpoint, my pursuer had circled the silo's foundation, snarling with undiminished rage. It attempted climbing but failed after minimal progress, nails scraping against metal surfaces as it slid downward. Continuing my ascent, I reached the small maintenance platform crowning the silo's dome. The elevated position prevented direct observation of the creature below, though its movements remained audible. Wind intensified at this height, chilling my sweat-soaked clothing uncomfortably. Consulting my watch again, nearly 6:30 a.m., with dawn approaching incrementally. Minutes stretched interminably before silence settled below. Cautiously returning to the silo's edge, I peered downward. The creature remained, having abandoned escape attempts in favor of patient waiting. Upon noticing my observation, it renewed climbing efforts with increased determination. I retreated to the platform's center, contemplating entering the silo itself, but recognizing the potential trap this would create. Multiple failed climbing attempts continued until distant headlights appeared along the access road. Hope surged as I began jumping vigorously, attempting to attract attention. The approaching vehicle maintained direct course toward our position, engine sounds growing progressively louder as it navigated the uneven terrain. A pickup truck crested the hill, headlights illuminating the barn before continuing toward the silos. The vehicle belonged to Roberto Rodriguez, who approached cautiously before stopping. Below, the creature remained visible despite the truck's arrival, momentarily assessing this new development. The standoff extended several seconds before the driver's door swung open and Roberto emerged holding a shotgun. He shouted commands in Spanish while bracing the weapon against the doorframe. The first shot struck the creature, sending fur flying from its massive form. It yipped sharply before turning toward this new threat. The distinctive pump-action sound preceded a second discharge, causing the creature to physically shudder and halt its advance. 2 additional shots followed in rapid succession. Remarkably, after absorbing multiple blasts at close range, the creature turned and fled rather than continuing its attack. "Get down now," Roberto shouted. "It might return." I descended rapidly, jumping into the truck's cabin while Roberto handed me the shotgun. "Reload this," he instructed while starting the engine. He activated the CB radio, contacting my grandfather with miraculous efficiency. "William, I found him. Over." My grandfather's voice transmitted relief without proper radio protocol. "Thank God." "William," Roberto continued, "remember that thing I told you about years ago? It's back, and it had your grandson trapped on your old silos. Over." "Just get back here," my grandfather responded. "Let me talk to my boy. Over." Upon returning to the farm, emotional reunions consumed several minutes. The search party had formed later than optimal, departing only after 10 p.m. when my absence became concerning. One worker examined my injuries, stitching several deeper lacerations while my grandfather organized a return expedition to the marsh area. Despite others' reservations, I insisted on accompanying them. At the quarry site, we discovered the sheep had vanished completely. We recovered them later that day, several miles from their initial location. More significantly, the portion of marsh adjacent to the rocky ledge had been completely transformed, buried beneath tons of rock from my inadvertent landslide. "There must be 2 truckloads of material here," one worker observed. Then, more ominously, "Looks like there were small caves underneath. Whatever lived down there probably wasn't happy about having its home destroyed." The implication settled heavily. I had inadvertently collapsed the creature's den, possibly burying others of its kind. If wolves operate in packs, why not these entities? The territory marking and relentless pursuit suddenly acquired contextual meaning, not random aggression but territorial defense and retribution. I never encountered another such creature during subsequent years on the farm. My grandparents eventually retired, with my siblings and I initially maintaining operations before my parents assumed full management. The experience permanently altered my perception of wilderness and the natural world, not through diminished appreciation, but through humble recognition of its mysteries. There exist entities in remote regions that defy conventional classification, neither fully animal nor mythical, but dangerous realities rarely encountered and less frequently survived. I share this account not to perpetuate fear, but to encourage respect for wilderness boundaries and the understanding that humanity's knowledge remains profoundly incomplete. I never had much of a family. Mom died when I was 14, her folks having cut her off years before I was even born. Dad spiraled after her death, in and out of psychiatric hospitals before he eventually took his own life when I was 19. The only living relative I was aware of was my paternal uncle, Jerome. One of the dark family secrets I actually knew was that Jerome blamed himself for my father's death. Shortly after the funeral, he'd built himself a log cabin deep in the Maine wilderness and had been living in seclusion ever since. I only had a rough idea of where the cabin was located, somewhere in the remote Debskeneg Lakes region, but I had even less desire to reach out to him. To be perfectly honest, Jerome was just as dead to me as my parents were, because the truth is I blamed him for my father's death too. The argument they'd had the night before Dad killed himself still echoed in my mind. Having someone to direct my anger toward, someone to blame, it was the only thing that allowed me a measure of peace after such a miserable childhood. Against all odds, by the summer of 2018, I had actually built something of a life for myself in the Boston area. I was assistant manager at a brewery pub called Harbor Hops. I had a small but nice apartment in Jamaica Plain. I even managed a couple of dates here and there, though nothing ever lasted. I was firmly in the process of putting my old life behind me, and that felt better than I can possibly describe. Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in early July. Plain white envelope, typed address, postmarked from Augusta, Maine. As soon as I saw which state it was from, I had an inkling of the news that would follow. I let it sit unopened on my kitchen counter for 3 days before finally mustering the courage to see what it contained. The letter was from Hastings and Burke, an attorney's office in Augusta. It stated in formal, detached language that Jerome Wilson had died on June 27th after a brief hospitalization. The firm had been tasked with dividing my uncle's estate among his surviving relations, which, as it turned out, consisted solely of me. I'd always assumed Jerome didn't have much money, and according to the letter, I was right about that. There was no property deed to transfer, no significant financial assets to speak of, but apparently I had been allocated something in his last will and testament. Yet, irritatingly enough, I'd have to go all the way to Augusta to find out what it was. I called the attorney's office that afternoon, lied about being too busy to make the drive, and just asked them straight up what I'd been left in the will. So imagine my curiosity when the lawyer, a Mr. Hastings, told me he had no idea what it was. All he had was a key to a safety deposit box located in an Augusta bank. He'd been paid in advance to ensure I opened the box and understood the significance of the contents. Nothing more, his only motivation being that the final portion of his payment was locked inside the box, too. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie, and only once Hastings had assured me he was deadly serious did I actually start to believe it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with it. It would be nothing but picking at old wounds, dragging up a past I'd worked so hard to leave behind. But peace of mind doesn't pay the bills, and as greedy as it sounds, if there was money to be had, I wanted a piece of it. I took a half day that Friday, July 13th. The irony of the date wasn't lost on me, and began the 5.5-hour round trip to Augusta. It's a pretty nice drive in the summertime, and the views of rural Massachusetts and coastal Maine managed to quiet my growing feelings of dread for as long as they were able. But as I pulled up outside the quaint, homely offices of Hastings and Burke, housed in a converted Victorian on Water Street, I felt like I was on the verge of a panic attack. My hands trembled slightly as I turned off the ignition. I'd somehow convinced myself that all I was going to get was a letter telling me some awful truth about my family, something that would ruin all the progress I'd made over the past few years. The office was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town law firm. Dark wood paneling, faded landscape paintings, and the lingering smell of coffee and old paper. Mr. Hastings was a gray-haired man in his 60s with round, wire-rimmed glasses and a practiced, neutral expression. "Mr. Wilson," he said, extending his hand, "I appreciate you making the trip. I understand it wasn't convenient." "Just call me Michael," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded despite my nerves. "And it's fine. I was curious." Hastings nodded. "Well, as I mentioned on the phone, I don't know exactly what's in the safety deposit box. Your uncle was quite insistent about the specific arrangements." He grabbed his coat from a rack by the door. "The bank is just a few blocks away, shall we?" You can only imagine my trepidation as we walked to the Augusta Savings Bank. I was actually clammy with nerves by the time the bank manager ushered us into the room housing the deposit boxes. My uncle's box was midway up the wall, small and unremarkable, bearing only the number 237. The manager unlocked it with his master key, then stepped aside to let me use the client key Hastings had given me. With a deep breath, I turned the key and pulled open the metal drawer. Inside was nothing but a wad of cash, bound with a rubber band and a single envelope. Hastings took the money, his final payment. But when it came to me opening the letter, I hesitated. It reached the point where he asked me if I was actually going to read it, or if I wanted some time alone. I hit him with what must have seemed like an unusual request. I wanted him to read the letter for me, then summarize it as clinically and coldly as possible. I knew I wouldn't be able to bring myself to read it for a long time, yet I had to know what it said. Jerome was blood, and as much as I hated him, honoring his final message was, at minimum, the right thing to do. I watched Hastings's face the whole time as he unsealed the envelope and removed a single sheet of paper. He briefly scanned the contents before a look of puzzlement came over his face. Sensing my impatience, he simply showed me what was written. It wasn't some long-winded apology or explanation. It wasn't a goodbye or a dying request. All that was written were a set of numbers that I figured were GPS coordinates, and 3 scrawled words: "Burn it all." When Hastings asked me what the significance of the coordinates was, I didn't have an answer for him. but a quick Google search confirmed they pointed to a seemingly random spot in the Debskanag Lakes wilderness area. I wasn't certain, but I was 90% sure this was the location of Jerome's cabin. But whatever he wanted me to burn was a complete mystery. In the space of about 10 minutes, I went from wanting nothing more to do with such a grim situation to being consumed with morbid curiosity. My imagination went into overdrive, and I theorized about all the dangerously illegal or disgustingly immoral things Jerome might have been up to out there. I just had to know more, because if he'd left some terrible, shameful legacy behind, I wanted to destroy it. The ride back to Hastings and Burke gave me an opportunity to politely grill the attorney on my uncle's death. I figured if he'd fallen ill or died at home, then someone must have seen the inside of his cabin. But according to Hastings, Jerome had driven himself to the hospital about a week before he died and had made the safety deposit box arrangement with him months before. So for all intents and purposes, the only person that had ever seen the inside of that log cabin was my uncle. Before I left the office, I asked Hastings his advice. I'll never forget what he said. Well, as my grandfather used to say, sometimes things bury you if you don't bury them first. He was right. I couldn't lose any more sleep over this nonsense. It had nearly killed me once before, and there was no way I was going to let that happen again. It was clear what needed to be done. I'd drive out to that cabin, do my uncle one last favor, and burn whatever horrible truth it contained to ashes. I spent the drive back to Boston making plans. I'd need to take Monday and Tuesday off work, which meant calling my boss, Kirsten, with some excuse about a family emergency, which wasn't entirely untrue. I'd need supplies, gasoline, matches, good hiking boots, insect repellent, a compass, first aid kit, and enough food and water for at least a day in the wilderness. As I drove, the endless trees along I-95 seemed to watch me pass, like silent sentinels harboring some dark knowledge I wasn't privy to. The rational part of my brain told me I was being ridiculous, that this was just a strange errand from a disturbed old man. But a deeper, more primal part of me felt a growing sense of dread. By the time I got back to my apartment, it was past 9 p.m. I should have been exhausted, but my mind was racing. I opened my laptop and began researching the Debskanag Lakes wilderness area, located just south of Baxter State Park. It's one of the largest roadless areas in the Northeast, encompassing nearly 50,000 acres of forest, lakes, and ponds. The name Debskanag comes from a Native American word meaning carrying place, referring to the portage routes between lakes. The area is remote, rugged, and largely untouched by human development, perfect for someone who wanted to disappear. I plotted the coordinates on a topographical map. Jerome's cabin appeared to be situated between 1st and 2nd Debskanag Lakes, about 3 miles from the nearest parking area. It wouldn't be an easy hike, especially carrying supplies for a controlled burn, but it was doable in a day. As I researched, my phone buzzed with a text from my colleague, Will. "Everything okay? Kirsten said you had to leave early." I typed back, "Family stuff, nothing major, back Monday." A lie. I wouldn't be back Monday. By Monday, I planned to be standing in the ashes of whatever dark legacy my uncle had left behind. I spent Saturday gathering supplies. At the hardware store, I bought a 5-gallon gas can, waterproof matches, a heavy-duty flashlight, and a compass. At the sporting goods store, I found a decent pair of hiking boots, a backpack, and some lightweight, quick-dry clothes. The clerk gave me a strange look when I asked about the best trails in the Debskanag area, but didn't press for details. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 words, burn, it, all. What could be so terrible that it needed to be completely destroyed? What had Jerome been doing out there all these years? By Sunday morning, I was already on the road north, the trunk of my car loaded with supplies. I planned to check into a motel near Millinocket, the closest town to the wilderness area, then set out at first light Monday morning. But 8 hours of sleep proved to be rather ambitious. When the clock on the motel wall ticked over to 2 a.m., I figured a better use of my time would be to scour Google Maps for the best route to the cabin. I studied the terrain, looking for streams to cross and hills to climb, trying to anticipate any obstacles I might face. By the time the first slivers of dawn began to creep onto the horizon, I was packed up and ready to go. I didn't figure I'd need much beyond what I'd already prepared: a jerry can of gas, waterproof matches, basic survival gear, and my printed maps. With an extra-large gas station coffee in my drink holder, I was ready for the hour-long drive to the trailhead. The entire drive, those 3 words echoed in my skull: burn it all. I've never been so consumed with curiosity in all my life. It was an ache, like that feeling when you hold your breath for too long and just need to let it all out. I had to know how Jerome had been living for the past 30 years, and what it was he wanted me to burn. But to explore that cabin would be to risk my sanity, when I could just burn the thing to the ground, walk away, and go on living. I tried so hard to make up my mind, but the truth is I didn't know what I was going to do until I was face to face with that old rotting cabin, face to face with the truth. The Golden Road, which leads into the heart of Maine's North Woods, is aptly named. In the early morning light, the dirt and gravel surface took on an amber hue, stretching before me like a ribbon into the unknown. The road was originally built by the paper companies to transport timber, but now serves as the main access point for recreation in this remote region. I passed only 2 other vehicles during the entire drive: a pickup truck with a canoe strapped to the top, and a Forest Service vehicle heading in the opposite direction. The isolation was palpable, a heavy weight pressing down on me as the miles of unbroken forest rolled by. When I reached the small parking area near the trailhead, I was the only one there. I double-checked my supplies, transferred the gasoline to 2 smaller containers that would be easier to carry, and locked the rest of my gear in the trunk. With my backpack filled with essentials and a printed map in hand, I set off into the woods. The trail started out well marked, a narrow path winding through towering spruce and fir trees. The morning was cool and damp, with fog clinging to the forest floor and dripping from the branches overhead. My footsteps were muffled by a thick carpet of pine needles, creating an unsettling silence broken only by the occasional call of a bird high in the canopy. According to my map, I needed to follow this main trail for about 2 miles before turning north on a less traveled path that would eventually lead me to the vicinity of the coordinates. From there, I'd have to navigate by compass. The first hour of hiking was uneventful. The well-maintained trail made for easy walking, and I made good time despite the weight of my pack. But as I ventured deeper into the wilderness, the atmosphere began to shift. The trees grew closer together, blocking out more of the sunlight. The underbrush became thicker, more tangled, and there was something else, a strange feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves, the natural unease that comes from being alone in an unfamiliar forest. But I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes tracking my movement, hidden among the shadows between the trees. When I was almost certain I was within walking distance of the coordinates, I veered off the trail as planned, heading northwest through increasingly dense forest. I had to check my compass frequently to stay on course, and progress became slower as I navigated around fallen trees and patches of swampy ground. About 30 minutes into this more challenging terrain, I began to notice something unusual about the area's flora, and it wasn't long before one particular sight stopped me dead in my tracks. There, lying in the dirt in front of me, was what looked like a cross between a pile of ground beef and a human brain. At first glance, I didn't think it was living, or at least once living flesh. The shade and texture of it was almost identical to raw meat, but I soon realized what I was looking at was actually a kind of fungus. I later discovered it to be Gyrometra esculenta, more commonly known as false morel or brain fungus. Although it can be highly poisonous, it's not an uncommon sight in northeastern forests. However, what was uncommon was the frequency with which I sighted these distinct-looking fungi, and these weren't the only strange mushrooms I encountered. The next variety I saw was even creepier than the last. While the brain fungus was just gross-looking, I mistook what I now know were Hadnellum mushrooms for chunks of bloody human tissue. These bleeding tooth or devil's tooth mushrooms exude a bright red substance that looks exactly like fresh blood. I later learned this liquid contains anticoagulant properties. In plain English, it looks like blood and can make you bleed easier if ingested. Creepy, right? But not nearly as unsettling as just how many of these disgusting specimens were dotted around the forest. They were everywhere, sometimes 2 or 3 around the base of every tree, and the closer I got to the coordinates, the more there seemed to be. I had a GPS app on my phone that was helping me track my location offline, but as it turned out, I didn't need any fancy equipment to find my way to the cabin. All I had to do was follow the mushrooms. As the fungal infestation grew denser, the forest itself began to change. The trees appeared sickly, their bark peeling in long strips like sunburned skin. The undergrowth thinned out, giving way to a spongy floor covered in a thin layer of what looked like gray mold. The air felt thicker here, humid and heavy in my lungs, carrying that faint smell I'd first noticed earlier, like meat left too long in a warm car. I checked my GPS. According to the coordinates, the cabin should be less than a quarter-mile ahead. Part of me wanted to turn back, to forget this whole misguided mission, and return to the safety of my apartment in Boston. But a stronger impulse drove me forward, a need to see this through, to confront whatever twisted legacy Jerome had left behind. The smell grew stronger with each step, evolving from merely unpleasant to actively nauseating. It was an organic stench, the reek of decay and fermentation. I pulled my t-shirt up over my nose, but it did little to filter the odor. And then the trees opened up suddenly into a small clearing, and I saw it. The cabin was smaller than I'd imagined, maybe 20 by 15 feet, with a shallow pitched roof covered in pine needles and moss. It might once have been charming in a rustic way, but years of neglect had transformed it into something from a nightmare. The logs that formed the walls were discolored and rotting in places, covered in patches of those same fungi I'd been seeing in the forest. They seemed to be growing more aggressively here, forming bizarre colonies that pulsed slightly in the still air. The brain fungus clustered around the foundation, while the bleeding tooth mushrooms sprouted from cracks between the logs, their red secretions staining the wood like tears of blood. The cabin had 2 windows facing me, both covered from the inside with what looked like black garbage bags. The front door hung slightly ajar, swinging gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. I stood at the edge of the clearing, unable to move closer. A million questions raced through my mind. What had Jerome been doing here? Why was the fungal growth so concentrated around his home? And what was creating that ungodly smell? I smelled the cabin's interior before I saw it, that pungent, almost stewed meat smell, but with a sickly, rotten taint to it. By the time I actually laid eyes on the filthy wooden paneling through the trees, I almost had to cover my mouth and nose in order to push forward. The structure was completely covered in those brain fungi and devil's tooth mushrooms, nestled where the wood met the soil or where moisture and dankness clung under the windowsills. I can't stress how utterly exhausted I was by this point either. It was almost noon, one of those cloudy summer days that just seals all the humidity in like a lid on a jar. I'd been hiking with about 2 gallons of gasoline in my backpack, which was no easy feat. I just wanted to get this over with so I could set off back to my car. But a thought struck me as I was pulling the gas cans from my backpack. I had no idea what the source of the smell was. If it was due to some kind of flammable gas, maybe that's what Jerome meant when he told me to burn it all. Maybe the place was primed to ignite, and all I needed to do was toss a match on it. But if it was indeed flammable, the intensity of the fumes meant I'd risk blowing myself up if I just tossed on an open flame from arm's length. So that raised the question of just what was making that god-awful stench. Finding out meant looking inside the cabin, something I'd promised myself I wouldn't do. But what harm could one little peek do? The journey out here had been depressing and confusing enough. Seeing how some miserable old hermit lived his life couldn't be so bad, could it? So why was I so terrified to open that front door? Standing before the cabin door, I fought against every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run. My hand trembled as I reached for the rusted handle. The door swung open with surprising ease, releasing a wave of hot, fetid air that nearly knocked me backward. In the dim light filtering through the trash bag-covered windows, I could make out the interior of Jerome's home for the past 3 decades. The space was small, maybe 300 square feet in total, with bare wooden walls and a plank floor. But it wasn't the cramped quarters that horrified me, it was what filled them. The inside of the cabin was just as infested with fungus as the outside, and it was so humid in there that it felt like a sauna. Mushrooms of various species grew from every surface, climbing up the walls, sprouting from the floorboards, hanging from the ceiling like grotesque stalactites. But these weren't just the brain fungi and bleeding teeth I'd seen outside. There were specimens I couldn't identify. bulbous, glistening forms that seemed to pulse with a life of their own, thin, finger-like growths that reached toward me as if sensing my presence, translucent caps that glowed with a faint bioluminescence even in the meager light. The first thing I saw as I covered my mouth and nose with the neck of my t-shirt was a huge pot on an old propane stove. Jerome had been dead for about a week by this point, but before he died, he'd filled that pot with enough of something that it was only just beginning to boil down as it slowly simmered away. The opening to the pot was stuffed with rubber piping, arterial little tubes that seemed to run all over the cabin, each pumping out a kind of vapor that simply must have been the source of the stench. The place looked like a cross between a drug factory and some mad scientist's lab. There were sodden, moldy books lying on the floor, a blackboard with some indecipherable pictograms on it. A folding table against one wall held an assortment of laboratory equipment, microscopes, petri dishes, beakers, and vials containing liquids in various shades of yellow and brown. Notebooks filled with dense handwriting were stacked in precarious piles, their pages warped from the humidity. In the corner was a cot with a thin mattress, the sheets stained with dark patches that I didn't want to examine too closely. Above the bed hung photographs, dozens of them, showing close-up images of various fungi in different stages of growth. Some appeared to be growing on lab animals, rats and mice with horrific fungal blooms erupting from their bodies. But what truly turned my stomach was the refrigerator. The ancient appliance hummed loudly in the corner, and against my better judgment I opened it. Inside were more specimens, tissue samples I guessed, stored in clear containers. Some were clearly animal in origin, small rodents and birds in various stages of fungal consumption, but others looked disturbingly human, fingers maybe or other small appendages, now serving as hosts for Jerome's mushroom colonies. I slammed the refrigerator shut and staggered backward, knocking over a stack of journals. They fell open to pages of meticulous notes, diagrams, and observations. Skimming them, I caught phrases like mycelial network expansion, neural integration potential, and consciousness diffusion theory. One passage in particular caught my eye. Day 3217. The network continues to expand beyond all expectations. What began as a localized colony has now spread throughout the surrounding forest. I've observed synchronized fruiting body emergence up to 1.2 miles from the central point, cabin. My hypothesis regarding neural mycelial interface appears correct. The network responds to stimuli in ways that suggest a form of distributed consciousness. I have begun testing integration with mammalian neural tissue with promising results. Self-integration experiment scheduled to begin next month. Self-integration. What the hell had Jerome been doing out here? That was just about all I could glimpse before my eyes started to water, and I was eventually forced to retreat from the open door, where I promptly vomited into the undergrowth. Those fumes were unbearable. My head was spinning, and I honestly thought I might pass out for a moment. I have no idea what Jerome was doing in there. All I know is that it had something to do with all those mushrooms. There were so many of them that I thought I could almost hear them moving or something. It was this repulsive intestinal hum that made my skin crawl to listen to. My uncle hadn't just been studying the fungi. He'd been cultivating them, experimenting with them. From what little I could gather from his notes, he seemed to believe they formed some kind of collective intelligence, a network of consciousness spread throughout the forest. And worse, he appeared to have been attempting to integrate himself into this network somehow. Had he succeeded? Was that why he wanted me to burn everything? To destroy what he'd become? I stumbled away from the cabin, gasping for fresh air that didn't exist in this fungal-choked clearing. My vision swam, and for a moment I thought I saw a movement among the trees at the edge of the clearing, not the motion of animals or wind, but a rippling, as if the entire forest was breathing in unison. I knew then what I had to do. After I collected myself, I wrapped my shirt around my face to create a makeshift respirator, then set about emptying the contents of the gas cans all over the outer walls of the cabin. I made sure to soak the base thoroughly, where the brain fungi clustered most densely, as well as the roof and door. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by eyes exactly, but by something more diffuse, a distributed awareness that permeated the very air around me. The forest had fallen completely silent. No birds called, no insects buzzed, no leaves rustled. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. I saved the last of the gasoline for the interior. Steeling myself, I entered the cabin one final time, splashing the accelerant over Jerome's equipment, his notes, his bed, and especially that simmering pot with its network of tubes. The fumes made me dizzy, but I forced myself to be thorough. Whatever was in here needed to be completely destroyed. As I backed out of the cabin, I noticed something I'd missed before, a small metal box tucked under the cot. Despite my urgency to finish the job and leave this place, curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pulled it out. It was a cash box, locked with a simple clasp that broke easily when I applied pressure. Inside was a single envelope addressed to me in Jerome's handwriting. With trembling fingers, I opened it and read, "Michael, if you're reading this, you found my research and hopefully understood why it needs to be destroyed. What began as an investigation into fungal communication became something more, something dangerous. These organisms aren't just alive. They're intelligent in ways we can't comprehend. They form a network that spans miles, communicates across vast distances, and can manipulate their environment, including us. I came here to escape after what happened with your father, but I found something worse than guilt. I found a truth that no one should know. I've gone too far, integrated too much of myself into the network. I can feel it growing inside me, changing me, using my knowledge to evolve. Burn it all, the cabin, the research, the forest if you can. Fire is the only thing it fears. Don't breathe the spores, don't touch the fruiting bodies, and whatever you do, don't linger after the burning starts. It will try to stop you. I'm sorry for everything, Jerome." I stood there for a long moment, the letter clutched in my hand as the implications of Jerome's words sank in. He hadn't just been studying the fungi, he'd somehow become part of them, or they had become part of him. And now he wanted me to destroy his life's work before it could spread further. With a shaking hand, I struck a match and tossed it onto the gasoline-soaked porch. The flames caught immediately, racing up the walls and across the roof with surprising speed. I stepped back, watching as fire consumed the tiny cabin and everything inside it. And I know it was just my ears playing tricks on me, that what I heard was just the sound of moisture escaping the soaked wood, but I could have sworn I heard the screams of that fungus as it burned. A high, thin wailing that seemed to come from everywhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath my feet and resonating in my chest cavity. More disturbing was what happened next. As the fire grew in intensity, the mushrooms around the clearing began to react. The bleeding tooth fungi secreted their red fluid more rapidly, dripping onto the forest floor in little crimson puddles. The brain fungi seemed to shrink in on themselves, their convoluted surfaces becoming even more twisted and knotted. And from deeper in the forest came a response, a wave of movement, like a ripple across the surface of a pond, traveling from tree to tree, disturbing the undergrowth as it passed. It was as if the entire ecosystem was recoiling from the threat, pulling back from the flames. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. With the cabin fully engulfed, I turned and ran, following my GPS back toward the trail and my car beyond. I didn't stop running until I reached the main path, and even then I maintained a brisk pace, constantly looking over my shoulder. The strange fungi became less numerous the further I got from the clearing, but I still noticed them watching me, if organisms without eyes can be said to watch, as I made my hurried retreat. The forest seemed to press in around me, branches reaching out as if to grasp at my clothes, roots rising up to trip my feet. It took me half the time to hike out as it had to hike in, powered by adrenaline and fear. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack in the trunk, jumped behind the wheel, and locked the doors. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. When I finally drove back home, I was no more enlightened than I had been before. If anything, I only had more unanswerable questions, more to keep me up at night when that not-knowing anxiety gets too much to bear. But still, I'm glad I burned that cabin down, that I didn't leave whatever darkness it contained to be stumbled upon by somebody else. I thought I might hear about it in the news, and for a day or two, I wondered if I'd accidentally started some kind of forest fire. But no news ever came, not even so much as a peep. And I figured that maybe it wasn't just Jerome who wanted whatever was up there to stay secret, that it all runs deeper than I could possibly imagine. In the days that followed, I did some research into fungal networks. There's legitimate science behind some of what Jerome was studying. Mycologists have discovered that fungi form vast underground networks, sometimes called wood-wide webs, that connect trees and other plants, allowing them to share resources and information. Some researchers have even suggested these networks display behavior that could be interpreted as a form of intelligence. But nothing I found in the scientific literature came close to what Jerome described in his notes. Nothing about human integration or consciousness diffusion. Either he'd gone far beyond current scientific understanding, or his isolation had driven him to delusion and madness. I tried to put it all behind me to return to my normal life in Boston, but I found myself constantly checking my skin for unusual growths, becoming paranoid about every mushroom I saw in the grocery store or growing in my neighbor's yard. I developed a persistent cough that 3 different doctors assured me was just seasonal allergies, but I couldn't shake the fear that I'd inhaled something in that cabin, that Jerome's work was now growing inside me. The nightmares were the worst. In them I was back in the clearing, but the cabin was intact and Jerome was there, only he wasn't entirely human anymore. His skin was pale and mottled with gray-green patches, and mushrooms sprouted from his shoulders and scalp. He would reach for me with hands that terminated not in fingers, but in thin white filaments that branched and branched again, endlessly dividing. "We are everywhere," he would say, his voice somehow coming from the ground, the trees, the air itself. "We are everything." I'd wake up gasping, convinced I could smell that same fetid odor from the cabin lingering in my bedroom. After a month of this, I couldn't take it anymore. I requested a transfer to Harbor Hop's San Diego location, as far from the forests of New England as I could get while keeping my job. To my relief, the company approved, and by September I was settling into a small apartment near Ocean Beach, where the dry, salty air seemed to cleanse my lungs and clear my head. The nightmares gradually subsided, and I started building a new life for myself. I met someone, Vanessa, a marine biology graduate student who loves the ocean as much as I've come to. We've been talking about marriage and kids, and I'll be damned if I do anything to mess that up. But sometimes when it rains, which isn't often in Southern California, I catch a whiff of something earthy and damp that takes me right back to those woods. And occasionally, when I'm walking through the farmer's market and past the mushroom vendor's stall, I swear I can hear that same intestinal humming I heard in the clearing. Last week, I received another letter from Hastings and Burke. Jerome had one final bequest that had been held in escrow, a USB drive containing all his research notes, digitized and organized. The letter said Jerome had instructed it to be delivered to me 1 year after his death, regardless of whether I had fulfilled his request to burn the cabin. I haven't plugged it in. I don't know if I ever will. Some knowledge isn't meant to be spread, and if you're ever out near the Debskanag Lakes, keep an eye out for those mushrooms. Because if you start seeing too many of them, it might be better for you if you went back the way you came. The forest is listening, and it remembers. It began with a phone call on a sweltering July morning in 2018. I'd been working cold cases at the Michigan State Police for nearly 7 years, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me at Lake Michigan that summer. "Detective Monroe," my captain's voice crackled through the phone. "We've got a situation at a vacation property north of Goodhart. Caretaker called it in. Says there's a smell that would make a vulture weep." Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. Family reported missing? The Winters family. Wealthy couple with 4 kids. Been out of contact for about a month, according to the neighbors. Nobody thought much of it. They often keep to themselves. I jotted down the address, a lakeside cottage called Pinewood, half a mile west of Lakeshore Drive. As I pulled my jacket from the chair, Captain added something that made me pause. "Monroe, you might want to prepare yourself. First responder says it's substantial." The drive to Goodhart took almost 3 hours. I spent it reviewing what little we knew about the Winters family. Robert and Judith, married nearly 20 years with children aged 7 through 19. Robert ran a publishing company specializing in arts magazines, while Judith managed their considerable investments. On paper, they were the picture of upper-middle-class success, but my years on the force had taught me that pristine facades often concealed the darkest secrets. As I approached the turnoff for Lakeshore Drive, I felt my hands tighten around the steering wheel. The secluded road wound through dense pine woods, sunlight filtering through in broken shafts. Beautiful country, but the isolation felt oppressive. By the time I reached the scene, 4 patrol cars and the medical examiner's van were already parked in a haphazard semicircle around a handsome log and stone cottage. Officer Reeves met me before I could reach the yellow tape. His face had the ashen pallor I'd seen too many times before, the look of someone who'd witnessed something their mind couldn't fully process. "I've seen 20 years of homicides," he said quietly, "and I've never—" He swallowed hard, unable to finish. The smell hit me before I entered, that distinctive, sickly sweet odor that anyone in my profession recognizes instantly. Death has a signature all its own, and in the summer heat it had reached its full, terrible potency. I pulled a mentholated mask over my face, but it did little to help. "Heat's been running full blast inside," said the ME Dr. Keller, stepping out of the doorway. Sweat streamed down her temples. "Whoever did this wanted decomposition accelerated. Makes time of death harder to pinpoint." As I entered Pinewood Cottage, I understood immediately why Officer Reeves had been so affected. What waited for me within those walls would haunt me for the remainder of my career and beyond. Before I describe what I found inside Pinewood, I should tell you more about the Winters family. My investigation would later reveal layers of complexity beneath their polished exterior. Robert Winters had built his publishing enterprise from scratch, starting with a small arts magazine in the late 90s. By 2018, he owned 3 periodicals and a digital media company, though records I would later obtain showed his financial situation had grown increasingly precarious. The art magazine that had been his flagship was hemorrhaging subscribers, and several large advertisers had recently pulled their contracts. His wife Judith came from old money. Her family had made a fortune in automotive parts manufacturing. Their marriage had been covered by society pages 19 years earlier, the elegant heiress and the ambitious publisher. They made a striking couple in photographs, Robert tall with distinguished salt and pepper hair, Judith petite with a perpetual composed smile. Their children represented different stages of their lives together. 19-year-old William, attending University of Michigan on a swimming scholarship, 16-year-old Peter, a high school junior with exceptional grades, 12-year-old Michael, who competed in junior chess tournaments, and 7-year-old Rebecca, who took ballet and played violin. When I later interviewed the family's friends and employees, I got an unsettling picture. Robert's administrative assistant had left after only 3 months, the 4th secretary to quit within 2 years. She wouldn't specify her reasons, only saying the working environment had become uncomfortable. Several female employees had departed under similar circumstances, though none had filed formal complaints. Meanwhile, financial records showed irregular activity in Robert's business accounts. Large sums moved between entities, loans taken against collateral already pledged elsewhere. Several investors had begun legal proceedings to recover funds they claimed had been misappropriated. The Winters neighbors in their primary residence, an upscale suburb of Detroit, described them as private but cordial. The family attended community functions, but rarely hosted at their own home. Robert was known to be generous with charitable donations when asked publicly, but could become irritable when financial matters were discussed at length. I discovered that young Rebecca's violin teacher had abruptly terminated their lessons 3 months before the family's disappearance. When pressed, she admitted that Robert had made inappropriate comments about her appearance during several sessions. These details created a troubling mosaic, a family presenting one face to the world while hiding significant dysfunction. Financial pressure, possible impropriety, and mounting legal trouble suggested Robert Winters was a man whose carefully constructed life was beginning to unravel. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have justified what happened to them at Pinewood Cottage. The interior of Pinewood Cottage was a study in contrasts, tasteful decor against unimaginable barbarity. I stepped over the threshold, and the unnaturally hot air engulfed me like a physical force. The thermostat had been deliberately set to 90 degrees, creating a greenhouse effect in the sealed space. The living room appeared relatively normal at first glance. Leather furniture, a stone fireplace, family photos on pine wood shelves. Then my eyes registered the dark stain that had seeped into the hardwood beneath an antique rug. Someone had attempted to hide it, but the volume of blood had overwhelmed their efforts. I followed Dr. Keller's lead through the main room. "The caretaker found Judith here," she said, indicating a space between the sofa and the fireplace. "She's already been removed to the van, but I took extensive documentation." She handed me her tablet, showing photographs of Judith Winters's remains. She had been positioned face down, a plaid throw blanket covering most of her body. The single gunshot wound to the back of her head suggested execution-style murder. The advanced decomposition made her nearly unrecognizable as the elegant woman from the family photographs. "Small caliber," I noted. .25, perhaps. "Correct," Dr. Keller confirmed. "Ballistics will verify, but that's my preliminary assessment." Moving deeper into the house, the sense of methodical horror intensified. In the kitchen, evidence markers surrounded a large bloodstain near the breakfast bar. "Robert Winters was found here," Dr. Keller explained. "Multiple gunshot wounds, both .25 caliber and what appears to be a .22 rifle. Additionally, significant blunt force trauma to the skull, brutal enough to cause extensive fracturing." The images she showed me were worse than I'd expected. Robert's decomposing remains lay positioned over a heating vent, his body bloated and discolored beyond recognition, the skull caved in on one side. "Someone wanted to make absolutely certain he was dead," I observed, noting multiple kill methods. "And accelerate decomposition," Dr. Keller added. The positioning over the vent was deliberate. What disturbed me most was the discovery in the adjacent family room. Dr. Keller didn't need to explain. The evidence markers and bloodstains told the story. Young Michael, only 12, had been found partially covering his father's body, as though he'd crawled to him in his final moments. A single gunshot to the head had ended his life. 7-year-old Rebecca's small body had been discovered nearby, her wounds showing particular savagery, multiple gunshots and devastating blunt force trauma, likely from a hammer or similar tool. The photos showed a child-sized blanket had been placed over her after death, a perverse gesture of care after such brutality. The 2 oldest Winters children had died in one of the bedrooms. William and Peter had multiple gunshot wounds to their heads. Peter also showed evidence of a rifle shot to his back, suggesting he'd been trying to escape when cut down. "There's more," Dr. Keller said quietly, leading me to a window. "Look at this." The broken window had been covered with cardboard from the inside, carefully secured with duct tape. Outside, underneath the window, we found a spent shell casing. "My theory," I said, "is that the attack began from outside. The shooter observed the family, then fired at Robert through this window. Once he was down, they entered the house and systematically eliminated witnesses." Dr. Keller nodded. "The evidence supports that. There's also this." She pointed to a single set of bloody footprints leading from the kitchen to the front door. Size 11 men's shoe, one perpetrator moving methodically through the house. The killer had then drawn all the curtains, secured the broken window, turned up the heat, and locked the doors behind them. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was calculated extermination, designed to eliminate an entire family and delay discovery of their bodies. The technical aspects of processing the Pinewood crime scene took almost 2 weeks. As primary investigator, I oversaw the meticulous collection of evidence, blood spatter analysis, ballistics, fingerprints, fibers, and the grim task of documenting decomposition to establish a timeline. The oppressive heat had accelerated decomposition significantly, making precise time of death calculations difficult. Dr. Keller's best estimate placed the murders between 4 and 5 weeks before discovery. This aligned with statements from neighbors who reported hearing loud noises around late June, which they had dismissed as hunters or firecrackers. The heat was strategic, Dr. Keller explained during our evening debriefing on the 3rd day. Whoever did this understood that decomposition would destroy certain evidence and complicate our timeline. I studied the photographs spread across the makeshift command center we'd established in a nearby motel room. The violence had been targeted yet excessive, particularly against Robert, with his multiple gunshot wounds and skull fracture. "This feels personal," I said. "The level of violence against Robert suggests our perpetrator had significant anger toward him specifically." Ballistics confirmed 2 weapons, a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol and a .22 caliber rifle. The pistol had been used on all victims, while the rifle had been used only on Robert and Peter. The hammer or similar blunt instrument used on Robert and Rebecca was never recovered. What haunted me most were the reconstructions of the family's final moments. Based on blood evidence and bullet trajectories, we determined that after Robert was shot through the window, the other family members had attempted to flee or hide. The children had been hunted through the house methodically, room by room. I kept returning to one particular detail: the blankets placed over Judith, Michael, and Rebecca after death. This strange act of post-mortem care suggested complexity in our killer's psychology, capable of brutal execution yet performing this ritual afterward. As we pieced together the family's movements in their final moments, I found myself emotionally affected in a way I hadn't experienced in years of homicide investigation. The evidence told a story of terror, children running from room to room, hiding under beds and in closets, while a methodical killer pursued them. "The oldest boy, William, appears to have tried to protect his siblings," noted our blood spatter analyst, pointing to evidence that suggested he had positioned himself between the killer and the younger children. "These defensive wounds indicate he likely confronted the assailant directly." During the second week, we expanded our investigation into the Winters' background. Financial records painted a picture of mounting distress. Robert had secured loans against the family's assets, including Pinewood Cottage itself. Several business associates reported increasingly erratic behavior in the months leading up to the murders. "He was desperate," one former colleague told me during an interview. "Last time I saw him, he was talking about a major investor who would solve everything, but he wouldn't say who it was. I got the impression this mysterious savior didn't exist." The breakthrough came when we discovered Robert's employee records. Among them was a file for Vincent Madsen, a former military man who had joined the company in 2015. Payroll records showed irregular bonuses paid to Madsen, far exceeding those of other employees in similar positions. When we investigated further, we found evidence that Madsen had been embezzling funds, creating fake vendor accounts and redirecting payments. More concerning was what we discovered when we obtained his purchase records. 2 weeks before the estimated date of the murders, Madsen had bought 2 Beretta pistols and an AR-7 rifle from a dealer in Traverse City. The calibers matched our murder weapons. I first met Vincent Madsen at his modest ranch house in the Detroit suburbs on a humid August afternoon. My partner, Detective Wells, accompanied me, positioned strategically by the front door as I conducted the interview. Madsen appeared unremarkable at first glance, mid-30s, average build, clean-cut with the rigid posture of his military background. He invited us in without hesitation, offering coffee with the practiced calm of someone accustomed to stress situations. "I was shocked to hear about the Winters family," he said, his voice steady. "Robert was more than a boss. He was a mentor." I noted the past tense, though we hadn't yet confirmed to him that the family was dead. "When did you last see Robert?" I asked. "Early June, before they left for Pinewood. He seemed normal, maybe a little preoccupied with business matters." Throughout the interview, Madsen maintained impeccable composure. He acknowledged working closely with Robert on financial restructuring, but denied any knowledge of impropriety. When I inquired about his recent firearm purchases, his expression didn't flicker. "I'm an enthusiast," he explained. "The Berettas were investments, limited editions, and the AR-7 is a common survival rifle." "Do you still have these weapons?" Detective Wells asked. A slight pause. "I sold the AR-7 to a colleague. The Berettas are in my safe." That pause told me everything. When we obtained a warrant to search Madsen's home the following day, the safe contained only 1 Beretta. The second pistol and the AR-7 were nowhere to be found. Our investigation accelerated after forensics confirmed that shell casings found at Pinewood matched the caliber and type of ammunition Madsen had purchased. His alibi for the estimated time of the murders, a weekend fishing trip with friends, began to unravel when one friend admitted they had separated for several hours during the trip. Vince said he needed to make a business call, the friend reported. Left Saturday morning, didn't come back until late Sunday. Said he had to drive to get cell reception. The timeline worked. Madsen could have driven to Pinewood, committed the murders, and returned to his fishing group without raising suspicion. When we brought Madsen in for formal questioning, I noticed subtle changes in his demeanor. The confident financial executive had been replaced by someone more cautious, more calculating. He requested an attorney immediately and declined to speak further. Polygraph tests were arranged as part of our investigation. Madsen failed too conclusively, showing significant stress reactions when questioned about the Winters family and his whereabouts during the estimated time of the murders. A third test was deemed inconclusive after the examiner noted Madsen was using countermeasures to manipulate the results. The picture that emerged from our financial investigation was damning. Madsen had embezzled nearly $1.2 million from Robert's companies over 3 years. Recently, Robert had begun implementing new accounting procedures that would have inevitably exposed the theft. Despite the mounting evidence, the district attorney was hesitant to proceed without the murder weapons or definitive physical evidence placing Madsen at the scene. When I pressed, he explained, "The case is circumstantial, strong but circumstantial. We need more." I spent nights poring over the evidence, convinced we had our man, but frustrated by the legal threshold for prosecution. Madsen had been too careful, too methodical in covering his tracks. Then, after weeks of surveillance and investigation, we caught a break. Madsen's father-in-law owned a rural property that included a small shooting range. When we searched the facility, we discovered AR-7 shell casings identical to those found at Pinewood Cottage. The district attorney finally agreed to move forward with charges. An arrest warrant was prepared, and we planned to apprehend Madsen the following morning. I never got the chance. At 6:42 a.m. on October 3rd, dispatch contacted me with urgent news. Vincent Madsen had been found dead in his garage, slumped over his desk with a single gunshot wound to his right temple. The weapon, a .25 caliber Beretta pistol, lay beside his right hand. I arrived at the scene within 30 minutes. The garage had been converted into a home office with a large desk positioned against the back wall. Madsen's body was still warm, suggesting he had taken his life shortly before dawn. On the desk, a typewritten letter had been partially soaked with blood. "I am a liar, a thief, and a fraud. I've stolen from the following individuals and companies." The letter continued with a detailed accounting of his financial crimes, including the embezzlement from Robert Winters' companies. But what struck me most were the handwritten lines added at the bottom of the page, in shaky but legible script. "I had nothing to do with what happened at Pinewood. I am a thief, but not a killer. I'm sick and terrified. Please forgive me." Forensic analysis later confirmed the Beretta used in Madsen's suicide was the missing pistol from his collection, and ballistics matched it to the .25 caliber rounds that had killed the Winters family. Madsen's suicide placed our investigation in limbo. Under Michigan law, an open murder case cannot be officially closed without conviction, but with our prime suspect dead, the investigation effectively ended. The case file would remain technically active but functionally cold. In the months that followed, I struggled to reconcile the evidence with Madsen's final denial. The financial motive was clear. Robert Winters had been on the verge of discovering Madsen's embezzlement, which would have meant prison time. The ballistic evidence was irrefutable. Madsen's weapons had been used in the killings. The timeline allowed for his involvement, and his behavior throughout our investigation suggested consciousness of guilt. Yet his final words haunted me. Had we pushed an innocent man to suicide, or was this a final manipulation, a killer's last attempt to sow doubt? I conducted additional interviews with Madsen's acquaintances, searching for insight into his personality and capabilities. His military record revealed a capable marksman with specialized training and infiltration tactics. Former colleagues described him as meticulous and controlled, never displaying anger or aggression, even under extreme pressure. Vincent was cold, one former coworker told me, not cruel, just absent emotionally, like he was always calculating something in his head. His wife, devastated by his suicide, maintained his innocence with absolute conviction. Vincent couldn't hurt anyone, she insisted. He was gentle with our children, with animals. He wasn't capable of violence. When I asked why he owned multiple firearms if he was so gentle, her answer was telling. He liked the precision, the control. It wasn't about violence, it was about mastery. That word, mastery, stayed with me. The Pinewood murders had been executed with precision. No DNA evidence, no witnesses, a crime scene manipulated to delay discovery and complicate investigation. The methodical killing of an entire family, including children, required not just capability, but a profound emotional detachment. I returned to the evidence again and again, searching for certainty. The shell casings at the shooting range, the missing weapons that had reappeared at Madson's suicide, the financial motive and opportunity. Every piece pointed to him, yet his final words cast a shadow of doubt that I couldn't dispel. 3 years after the Pinewood murders, I still visit the cottage. The property remains unsold, a silent memorial to the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. Local residents have developed their own mythology around the place, stories of lights seen through windows at night, the sounds of children's voices carried on the lake breeze. I don't believe in ghosts, but I understand the human need to make sense of senseless violence. The true horror of what happened at Pinewood isn't supernatural. It's the calculated elimination of an entire family by someone they likely trusted. The technical aspects of the case still haunt me professionally. Despite exhaustive investigation, we never found direct evidence linking Madsen to the scene. No fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. His methodical approach to covering his tracks speaks to premeditation and experience. I've consulted with criminal psychologists about the case. One theory suggests the blankets placed over some victims indicated remorse, a killer who felt compelled to complete his mission but retained enough humanity to perform this ritual afterward. Another expert proposed a more disturbing interpretation. The blankets weren't signs of remorse but of ownership, a killer claiming dominion over his victims even in death. What continues to trouble me is Madsen's military background. His service records indicated deployment to classified operations before his honorable discharge. Could his training have included methods of killing and crime scene manipulation that explained his ability to commit such violence without leaving traceable evidence? I've also questioned whether Madsen acted alone. Though evidence pointed to a single perpetrator, the level of planning required to execute the murders and successfully evade immediate detection suggests possible collaboration. Yet no accomplice has ever been identified. In my darkest moments, I wonder if we focused too narrowly on Madsen. Were there other suspects, business rivals, disgruntled employees, or even family members with hidden motives that we overlooked? The financial angle provided a clean narrative, but human relationships are rarely so straightforward. Robert Winter's history of inappropriate behavior toward female employees could have created enemies we never identified. The family's wealth might have motivated kidnapping that escalated to murder. The possibilities multiply when I allow myself to question our conclusions, but then I return to the evidence. The weapons, the timeline, the financial motive, Madsen's suicide with the murder weapon. Occam's razor suggests he was our killer, despite his final denial. What I find most disturbing, regardless of who pulled the trigger, is the reminder of how vulnerable we all are. The Winters family retreated to their lakeside sanctuary, never suspecting it would become their tomb. Their privilege and wealth provided no protection against determined violence. The case files remain in my home office, copies I made before officially passing the investigation to cold case status. Sometimes late at night, I spread the photographs and reports across my desk, searching for something we missed, some detail that might provide the absolute certainty that continues to elude me. In the end, I believe Vincent Madsen killed the Winters family. The evidence, though circumstantial, forms a coherent narrative that resists alternative explanations. His suicide using the murder weapon serves as a final, if inadvertent, confession. Yet the legal principle that underpins our justice system, proof beyond reasonable doubt, remains technically unfulfilled. Without trial, without conviction, the case exists in perpetual ambiguity. Those who knew and loved the Winters family must live with this uncertainty, this lack of definitive resolution. During my last visit to Pinewood Cottage, before it was permanently sealed, I stood in the living room where Judith Winters had died, and felt the weight of knowing what had happened there without being able to prove it conclusively. The walls held secrets that would never be spoken. The true horror of the Pinewood murders isn't just the violence that ended 5 lives. It's the methodical planning that preceded it, and the careful concealment that followed. It's the reminder that someone can extinguish an entire family and nearly escape accountability through calculation and patience. I sometimes think about what Robert Winters might have felt in his final moments. The realization that his financial dealings had brought destruction not just to himself, but to his innocent children. Did he understand who was killing them and why? Did he recognize the betrayal before darkness claimed him? The youngest victims, Michael and Rebecca, haunt me most. Children who had no part in their father's business dealings or personal failings, yet paid the ultimate price for them. The savagery shown particularly to Rebecca suggests a killer who had moved beyond rational motive into something more primal. My investigation of the Pinewood murders changed me professionally and personally. I've become more attentive to the hidden currents that run beneath seemingly normal lives, the financial pressures, inappropriate behaviors, and small betrayals that can eventually erupt into violence. I've also developed a deeper appreciation for the limitations of justice. Even when we identify the responsible party with reasonable certainty, perfect closure remains elusive. The law requires standards of evidence that reality doesn't always provide. Vincent Madsen's suicide denied the Winters family's relatives the closure of a conviction, but it also spared them the ordeal of a trial where horrific details would become public record. Perhaps in some way this was a final mercy, though I doubt they would see it as such. The Pinewood case files remain technically open. Every few months I review them, hoping fresh perspective might reveal something new. But the truth is, some mysteries resist complete resolution. Some questions have answers we can approach but never fully grasp. What happened at Pinewood Cottage in the summer of 2018 will never be proven in a court of law. The killer, whether Madsen or someone else, will never face earthly justice. The methodical horror visited upon the Winters family remains a shadow in the collective memory of the community, a reminder that behind even the most perfect facades, darkness can lurk, and sometimes that darkness escapes into the world with consequences too terrible to comprehend. I never intended to become an expert on serial killers. My career as a crime journalist began with reporting on routine burglaries and petty theft in Northern California. But that changed on a rain-soaked November evening in 2019 when I received a package from a retired detective named Howard Walsh. Inside was a worn manila folder containing investigation notes, crime scene photographs, and interview transcripts related to one of California's most disturbing murder cases. A handwritten note from Walsh read, "You're the only one I trust to tell this story properly. Something about these earthquakes doesn't sit right with me." The name on the file was Richard Hayes, a man responsible for 13 murders across Santa Cruz County between 1972 and 1973. I had heard whispers about the case during my journalism studies, but the details were far more disturbing than anything I had imagined. That night, as rain lashed against my apartment windows and distant thunder rolled across the bay, I began reading through the documents. The photographs made my stomach churn, mutilated bodies arranged in ritualistic patterns, victims ranging from college students to elderly men, all connected by one man's twisted delusion about preventing earthquakes through human sacrifice. I called Walsh the next morning. "Why me?" I asked. "Why now?" "Because you're not afraid to look at the uncomfortable possibilities," he replied, his voice gravelly from decades of cigarettes. "And because there was a 5.4 magnitude quake last week right after Hayes was denied parole for the 12th time. It's the 3rd time it's happened. Denial of parole followed by seismic activity within days." I laughed nervously. "You can't possibly believe there's a connection." Walsh was silent for a long moment. "I don't know what I believe anymore. But I spent 30 years in law enforcement, and I've never seen a case that haunted me like this one. Something about his conviction, the absolute certainty in his eyes when he talked about the earthquakes, it got under my skin. I agreed to investigate, thinking I'd write a straightforward piece about a delusional killer and the detective who couldn't let the case go. But as I delved deeper into the Hayes case, speaking with witnesses who were still alive, visiting crime scenes that had long since been transformed by time, and corresponding with Hayes himself, the lines between coincidence and causality began to blur in ways that challenged my understanding of reality. What follows is my account of Richard Hayes, the earthquake killer, based on police records, court transcripts, personal interviews, and my own investigation. I've changed some names out of respect for the victims' families, but everything else is presented as I discovered it. Whether you see this as the chronicle of a deeply disturbed man or something more sinister depends on how comfortable you are with coincidence and how willing you are to consider that perhaps not all of this world's terrors can be easily explained. Richard Hayes was born on April 12, 1948 in Monterey, California, the only child of Gregory Hayes, a decorated World War II veteran, and Maureen Hayes, a homemaker. From all accounts, the Hayes household operated with military precision under Gregory's iron-fisted rule. I tracked down Brian Wilson, Richard's childhood neighbor, who now lives in a retirement community in Palo Alto. The father was strict but fair, Wilson told me over coffee in the community's garden. He wasn't abusive in the way we'd recognized today, but he ran that house like it was Fort Bragg. Everything had to be just so. According to school records I obtained, Richard was a remarkably well-adjusted child despite his rigid upbringing. His high school yearbook from San Lorenzo Valley High showed a handsome young man with a crooked smile and intelligent eyes, voted most likely to succeed by his peers. He was charming, recalled Irene Dawson, a former classmate I interviewed by phone. Smart, too, could talk about anything, history, science, politics, but there was something, I don't know how to describe it, like he was watching everyone from behind a glass wall. The real turning point in Richard's life came in 1966, shortly after his high school graduation. His best friend, Michael Jenkins, was killed instantly when a drunk driver swerved into him on Highway 17. The death devastated Richard. It was like someone flipped a switch, Irene told me. He withdrew completely, started talking about how Michael was sending him messages, how there was a purpose to his death that Richard had to figure out. Within weeks of Michael's death, Richard had constructed an elaborate shrine in his bedroom. Candles, photographs, and mementos arranged with obsessive precision. His girlfriend at the time, whose name was redacted in the police files but whom I'll call Patricia, later described the shrine to investigators as deeply disturbing, like something you'd see in a horror movie. Patricia reported that Richard began questioning his sexuality, wondering if his grief was so profound because he had been in love with Michael. He started experimenting with LSD and marijuana, claiming the drugs helped him communicate with Michael's spirit. This behavior drove a wedge between him and Patricia, and they broke up by the end of 1966. What followed was a rapid descent into mental illness. In investigating Richard's medical history, I discovered he had voluntarily committed himself to Agnew State Hospital in 1969 at the age of 21. The attending psychiatrist noted symptoms consistent with paranoid schizophrenia, though no formal diagnosis was made at that time. I visited Agnew's, now closed and largely abandoned, during my investigation. Standing in the crumbling remains of the East Wing where Richard would have stayed, I couldn't help but feel a chill as I imagined his experiences there, the confusion, the fear, the gradual formation of the delusions that would eventually drive him to kill. Richard moved between various institutions over the next few years, never staying long enough to receive consistent treatment. By 1972, his behavior had become increasingly erratic. Landlords evicted him for shouting at invisible entities. He attempted to join the priesthood but was rejected. He applied to the Marines, as his father had done, but was turned away due to his history of drug use. It was during this period that Richard's fixation on earthquakes began to take shape, a delusional framework that would eventually provide him with the justification for murder. What transformed Richard Hayes from a troubled young man into a killer was a theory so bizarre yet internally consistent that it continues to disturb me even now, years after I first encountered it. I spent weeks poring over Richard's prison journals, which Walsh had obtained copies of through his law enforcement connections. In neat, meticulous handwriting, Richard had documented his discovery of the connection between human sacrifice and seismic activity. "The earth hungers for blood," he wrote in one entry from 1971. "It has always been so. The ancient ones knew this. The Aztecs, the Mayans, the early Californians. Blood must be spilled to keep the ground from shaking. This is why wars exist, not for land or resources or ideology, but to feed the hunger below." Richard's theory centered on his birthday, April 12th, just 6 days before the anniversary of the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906. His proximity to this date seemed significant to him, as if he had been chosen by fate to understand the patterns that others couldn't see. In my research, I created a timeline of California earthquakes alongside American military conflicts, just as Richard had done. What disturbed me wasn't that his theory was completely baseless. There were indeed fewer major earthquakes during periods of significant American military involvement, but that this coincidence had become the foundation for such horrific acts. I visited the San Francisco Earthquake Memorial one foggy morning during my investigation. Standing there, reading the names of the more than 3,000 people who died in the 1906 disaster, I tried to understand how Richard's mind had twisted historical fact into supernatural causation. According to his journals, Richard believed that an ancient malevolent entity lived deep beneath California, an entity that fed on human souls. Earthquakes were this being's way of claiming victims when insufficient blood was being spilled through warfare. This is why, Richard claimed, the 1906 earthquake had been so devastating. It occurred during a period of relative peace between American conflicts. In contrast, during World War I, World War II, and the Korean War, California had experienced fewer deadly earthquakes. But as American involvement in Vietnam began to wind down in the early 1970s, seismic activity had increased again, culminating in the 1971 San Fernando Valley earthquake that injured thousands. To Richard, this pattern was clear evidence of what needed to be done. If American soldiers weren't dying in sufficient numbers overseas, then sacrifices had to be made at home to appease the underground entity and prevent a catastrophic earthquake from destroying California. "I'm not a murderer," he wrote in his journal. "I'm a savior. Every life I take saves thousands. The blood of the few for the salvation of the many." Perhaps most disturbing was Richard's methodology for selecting victims. He didn't choose at random. Each victim had, in his twisted logic, somehow volunteered for sacrifice through signs only he could interpret. A hitchhiker making a particular gesture, a priest saying certain words during confession, teenagers trespassing in what Richard considered sacred ground, all became, in his mind, willing sacrificial lambs. I interviewed Dr. Josephine Weber, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Richard during his trial. "His delusion was remarkably systematic," she told me in her Oakland office. "Most paranoid schizophrenics have disorganized thinking, but Richard had constructed a complete cosmology to explain his actions. He genuinely believed he was saving lives." As I left Dr. Weber's office that day, the ground trembled slightly beneath my feet, just a minor tremor, common enough in the Bay Area. But after weeks of immersing myself in Richard's writings, I couldn't help but glance nervously at the sky, wondering for a moment if there might be some terrible logic to his madness after all. Richard Hayes claimed his first victim on October 13, 1972. The date wasn't arbitrary. It marked exactly 1 year after a minor earthquake had struck near San Jose, which Richard had interpreted as a warning. The victim was William Jennings, a former high school acquaintance who had introduced Richard to marijuana years earlier. In Richard's distorted worldview, Jennings had become a servant of the underground entity, deliberately sabotaging Richard's attempts to join the Marines by getting him addicted to drugs. I visited the location of the murder, a modest cabin off Mystery Spot Road outside Santa Cruz. The current owner, unaware of the property's history when she purchased it 5 years ago, allowed me to look around after I explained my investigation. "I've always felt something strange here," she told me as we walked through the small living room where Jennings had died. "Like the air is heavier. I thought it was just the isolation, being surrounded by these redwoods. Now I wonder." According to police reports, Richard had tracked Jennings to this cabin after discovering he had moved from his previous residence. But when he arrived, he found not Jennings but a woman named Rebecca Foster, who had recently purchased the property from him. In a moment that demonstrates the calculated nature of Richard's actions despite his mental illness, he convinced Foster to give him Jennings's new address in Santa Cruz. He then drove to the address, talked his way inside, and shot both Jennings and his roommate at close range with a .22 caliber pistol. What happened next revealed the ritualistic nature of Richard's killings. He mutilated both bodies, arranging them in positions that, according to his journals, would maximize the spiritual energy released for the earthquake entity. Police photographs that I've chosen not to describe in detail show a level of ritualistic precision that contradicts the image of a man completely lost to psychosis. After killing Jennings and his roommate, Richard returned to Foster's cabin. In what investigators later determined was a move to eliminate the witness who could connect him to Jennings, he shot Foster and her 2 young sons, ages 4 and 9. Standing in that cabin, I felt a profound sense of dread as I imagined the scene, a young mother and her children, their lives ended by a man who believed he was performing a necessary sacrifice to save countless others. "The first is always the hardest," Richard wrote in his journal entry that night. "But the earth drank deeply. I felt the gratitude from below. The tremors that might have destroyed cities have been satisfied with these 5 souls." Police initially attributed the Foster family murders to drug connections, as Foster's estranged husband had been involved in narcotics trafficking. This misinterpretation allowed Richard to continue his killing spree unchecked for months. I spoke with retired Detective Michael Rodriguez, who had been a junior officer assigned to the Foster case. "We were looking in completely the wrong direction," he admitted as we sat in his garden in Watsonville. "We were convinced it was a drug hit. The idea that someone would kill a mother and her children as part of some earthquake prevention ritual. It wasn't even on our radar." Rodriguez's eyes grew distant as he recalled the crime scene. "Those kids, I still see their faces in my dreams. And to think that while we were chasing down drug connections, Hayes was out there selecting his next victims. That's the part that still haunts me." As I left Rodriguez's home that evening, the weight of what Richard had done, and what was still to come, sat heavily on my shoulders. 5 lives had been extinguished, and no one had connected the dots. Richard was free to continue his mission, convinced that his actions were preventing a catastrophe rather than creating one. Between October 1972 and February 1973, Richard Hayes's killing methodology evolved into an elaborate ritual that reflected his deepening delusion. Each murder was carefully planned, yet paradoxically, he believed he wasn't choosing his victims. They were being offered to him by the underground entity. I obtained access to Richard's personal calendar from this period, preserved as evidence by the Santa Cruz County District Attorney's Office. The document is disturbing not for what it explicitly states, but for its mundane appearance, movie times and laundry reminders interspersed with cryptic symbols that, investigators later determined, marked days when Richard believed the signs indicated a sacrifice was needed. His 3rd victim was Joseph Miller, a 58-year-old homeless man whom Richard encountered hitchhiking near Davenport. According to Richard's confession, Miller made a specific gesture, touching his temple with his index finger, that Richard interpreted as a sign that Miller was volunteering to be sacrificed. Richard picked Miller up, drove him to a secluded location off Highway 1, and asked him to look at the car's engine, claiming it was making a strange noise. When Miller leaned over the engine, Richard struck him repeatedly with a baseball bat. In his journal, Richard wrote, "The vagrant was Jonah reborn. He spoke to me telepathically. Pick me up, throw me over the boat, kill me so that others shall live. I am merely the instrument of his sacrifice, not its author." The murder scene, which I visited on a foggy morning in January 2020, is now an unremarkable turnout overlooking the Pacific. Standing there, watching the waves crash against the rocks below, I tried to imagine the violence that had occurred in this peaceful spot. A small wooden cross, weathered by salt air and time, had been placed near the edge of the cliff. Not for Miller, whose body was found miles away, but for a teenager who had died in a car accident years later. The coincidence of memorials for unrelated deaths gave me chills. Richard's 4th victim represented a shift in his selection process. Gwendolyn Morrison, a 24-year-old university student, was running late for a job interview when she decided to hitchhike along Highway 9. Richard picked her up, drove her to a remote area near Boulder Creek, and stabbed her multiple times. What distinguished this murder from the others was its aftermath. Richard dismembered Morrison's body and arranged the parts along Henry Cowell State Park Road in what he called a sacrificial distribution designed to maximize the spiritual energy across the fault line. A park ranger discovered Morrison's remains the following morning. The shock of finding a young woman's dismembered body scattered along a scenic forest road sent shockwaves through the community. For the first time, people began locking their doors in an area known for its safety and tranquility. I interviewed the ranger, now in his 70s, and still visibly shaken by what he had found that day. "I've seen dead bodies before, car accidents, drownings, even a suicide," he told me at his home near Felton. "But nothing prepares you for something like that. It wasn't just that she was dead, it was the deliberate arrangement, like some kind of horrible artwork. That's when I knew we weren't dealing with an ordinary killer." Richard's fifth murder took place at St. Anne's Catholic Church in Los Gatos. Father Gregory Bennett, a 65-year-old priest who had served as a resistance fighter in France during World War II, was hearing confessions when Richard entered the booth. According to witnesses, Richard confessed to his previous murders, then interpreted Father Bennett's response as an offer to become the next sacrifice. He stabbed the priest multiple times through the confessional screen before calmly walking out of the church. "He wanted to die for the cause," Richard wrote afterward. "He understood the necessity. He gave himself willingly to prevent the shaking of the earth." As I sat in that same church during my investigation, watching parishioners light candles and kneel in prayer, I was struck by the contrast between the peaceful sanctuary and the violence that had occurred there. A small plaque commemorating Father Bennett hung near the confessional, describing him as a servant of God who had died in service to his faith. The plaque made no mention of how he died or who killed him. By January 1973, Richard's delusion had reached its apex. He began carrying a high-powered rifle in his car, prepared to make sacrifices whenever the signs appeared. It was with this weapon that he committed his sixth murder, shooting retired fisherman Harold Reynolds as the man tended to his front yard in Santa Cruz. This killing, performed in broad daylight with multiple witnesses, demonstrated Richard's complete disconnection from reality. He made no attempt to hide his actions, believing himself protected by the entity he served. One witness described him as appearing completely calm, like he was posting a letter, as he aimed and fired. By late January 1973, law enforcement agencies throughout Santa Cruz County were working around the clock to identify the killer responsible for what seemed to be unrelated murders across the region. The breakthrough came when a witness to the Reynolds shooting provided police with a partial license plate number and a description of Richard's station wagon. I interviewed former Sheriff's Deputy Warren Reynolds, no relation to the victim, who was part of the task force assembled to catch the killer. "We were dealing with what seemed like completely different MOs, Reynolds told me as we walked along the Santa Cruz wharf. A shooting here, a stabbing there, dismemberment in another case. The only connection was geographic proximity. We had no idea one person was responsible for all of them." Reynolds, now in his 80s with a sailor's weathered face, stopped to look out at the ocean. "I remember the moment we realized it was one guy. We had assembled all the case files and someone noticed that the lunar phases aligned with the killings. Every murder had occurred within 3 days of a full moon. It seemed insignificant at first, but it was our first real pattern. This pattern, combined with witness descriptions and the partial license plate, gave investigators enough to begin a targeted search for Richard Hayes. They circulated his description to patrol officers throughout the county, instructing them to approach with extreme caution given the violent nature of the crimes. Meanwhile, unaware that police were closing in, Richard committed what would become his most notorious murders. On February 10, 1973, he encountered 4 teenage boys camping illegally near an old cabin in Henry Cowell Redwood State Park. According to Richard's subsequent confession, he approached the boys and identified himself as a park ranger, admonishing them for trespassing on what he considered sacred ground. When the boys mocked him, Richard grew enraged, believing they were deliberately desecrating land that served as a pressure valve for the earthquake entity. He shot all 4 boys with his pistol, arranged their bodies in a specific pattern he claimed would channel their spiritual energy into the earth, and left them undiscovered for nearly a week. I visited this site on a cold February morning in 2020, almost exactly 47 years after the murders. The cabin has long since been removed, but a small clearing remains, surrounded by towering redwoods that seem to stand guard over the tragic history of the place. Sitting on a fallen log, I read through the statements of the parents who had identified their sons' bodies, their words of grief and incomprehension still painful decades later. As I prepared to leave, I noticed something I hadn't seen when I arrived. 4 small stone cairns arranged in a semicircle at the edge of the clearing. Each had been carefully constructed and maintained, suggesting recent visits. I asked a park ranger about them later, and he shrugged. They appeared a few years ago. We assumed they're memorials for those boys, but no one's ever claimed responsibility for building them. The timing of these final murders proved crucial to the investigation. 3 days after the boys were killed, on February 13, 1973, Officer James Barnett spotted Richard's station wagon at the intersection of Highway 9 and Coral Street in Santa Cruz. He immediately called for backup, but, seeing the rifle clearly visible on the passenger seat, decided to make the stop before Richard could drive away. "I thought I was going to die that day," Barnett told me when I tracked him down at his retirement home in Arizona. "I'd seen the crime scene photos. I knew what this guy was capable of. But when I approached the car with my weapon drawn, he just looked at me with this eerily calm expression and put his hands on the steering wheel. He said, 'I've been expecting you. The work is done for now.'" Richard Hayes was taken into custody without resistance, ending a 4-month killing spree that had claimed 13 lives. But as investigators would soon discover, the horror of his crimes was matched only by the bizarre logic that had motivated them. I've listened to the audio recordings of Richard Hayes's confession dozens of times. What strikes me is not just the content, but the tone, measured, articulate, almost professorial, as he explains his theory about earthquakes and human sacrifice. There's no remorse, no recognition of the suffering he's caused, only a calm certainty that his actions were necessary and justified. "You have to understand the patterns," Richard told detectives in the initial interview. "Between October 13, 1972 and February 13, 1973, there wasn't a single earthquake in California, not one. That's unprecedented. That's because of me, because of the sacrifices I made." When a detective pointed out that California often goes months without significant seismic activity, Richard smiled knowingly. "That's what they want you to think. The government suppresses the data. They know about the entity below. They've always known." The interrogation room where Richard confessed is still in use at the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office. I sat in the same chair where he had sat, facing the same institutional green walls, trying to understand the mind of a man who could kill so methodically while believing he was saving lives. Richard's confession extended over 3 days, during which he provided details about each murder that only the killer could have known. He drew diagrams showing how he had arranged his victims' bodies to maximize the spiritual energy transferred to the underground entity. He recited conversations with victims that had never been made public. He described murder weapons that had not yet been recovered. Most disturbing was his absolute lack of remorse. When shown photographs of his victims, including the children he had killed, Richard expressed no emotion. "They were chosen," he said simply. "Their sacrifice meant something. Their deaths had purpose." Dr. Melissa Rivera, the court-appointed psychiatrist who examined Richard prior to his trial, shared her notes with me on the condition that I not quote directly from them. What emerges from her assessment is a portrait of a man whose mental illness had created an internally consistent but completely delusional worldview, one in which murder was not only justified, but necessary for the greater good. Rivera diagnosed Richard with paranoid schizophrenia, complicated by religious delusions and possibly temporal lobe epilepsy. She noted that despite his psychosis, Richard retained the ability to plan his crimes, avoid detection, and function in society, factors that would ultimately lead to his being found legally sane at trial. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of Richard's confession came when he was asked if he would have continued killing had he not been apprehended. "Of course," he replied without hesitation, The work is never done. The Earth's hunger is never satisfied. Someone has to feed it, if not with war, then with sacrifice. Richard Hayes was charged with 13 counts of first-degree murder. His trial began in July 1973, with the sole question being whether he was legally sane and therefore responsible for his actions. The prosecutor in the case, District Attorney Martin Reynolds, again no relation to the victim, built his case around Richard's methodical planning and efforts to avoid capture, arguing that these demonstrated an awareness that his actions were wrong. The defense countered with extensive testimony about Richard's mental illness and his genuine belief that he was preventing earthquakes. In August 1973, after just 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richard guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the killings of William Jennings and Rebecca Foster, considering these to show premeditation and awareness of wrongdoing. For the other 11 murders, he was found guilty of second-degree murder, the jury accepting that these were more impulsive acts driven by his delusions. Richard Hayes was sentenced to life imprisonment in California State Prison. He has been denied parole 11 times since becoming eligible in 1983, with psychologists consistently finding him still delusional and dangerous despite decades of treatment. I corresponded with Richard during my investigation, receiving 3 letters that maintained his earthquake theory with unwavering conviction. "The evidence is clear for those willing to see it," he wrote in his final letter. "Every time they deny my parole, the earth shakes within days. They know I'm right. They've always known." I began this investigation as a skeptic, convinced that Richard Hayes was simply a deeply disturbed man whose delusions had led him to commit horrific acts of violence. I expected to write an article about mental illness and the failures of the healthcare system, perhaps with a focus on how Hayes had fallen through the cracks, despite multiple hospitalizations. What I didn't expect was to find myself questioning the neat boundaries between coincidence and causation, between delusion and perception. The fact is that on February 21, 1973, just 11 days after Richard Hayes was arrested, a 5.8 magnitude earthquake struck Point Mugu in Southern California, causing over $1 million in property damage. This was the first significant seismic event in California since before Richard began his killing spree. Similarly, 3 of Richard's 11 parole hearings have been followed by earthquakes measuring above 5.0 on the Richter scale within 2 weeks of the denial. The most recent, a 5.4 magnitude quake near San Jose in 2019, occurred just 3 days after his last hearing. Coincidence? Almost certainly. The statistical correlation between Richard's activities and seismic events is easily explained by California's frequent earthquakes and the human tendency to find patterns where none exist. As Dr. Eleanor Wright, a seismologist at UC Berkeley whom I consulted for this article, told me, there's absolutely no scientific mechanism by which human activity, including murder, could influence tectonic plate movement. And yet, sitting in my apartment on the night I finished my research, reading through Richard's journals one last time, I felt an unexpected tremor shake my building. It was minor, barely enough to rattle the windows, but it sent an involuntary chill down my spine. I checked the USGS website immediately. A 3.2 magnitude quake, centered near Hollister. Nothing unusual for California, nothing to do with Richard Hayes or human sacrifice or ancient underground entities. But for just a moment, I understood how a mind already predisposed to seeing patterns could make the leap from coincidence to causation. I understood how Richard Hayes, his thinking distorted by mental illness and grief over his friend's death, could construct a worldview in which his horrific actions served a greater purpose. Richard Hayes will likely spend the rest of his life in prison, his parole denied every few years by a board that continues to find him dangerous despite his advancing age and declining health. The families of his victims continue to live with the knowledge that their loved ones died, not for any comprehensible reason, but because they had the misfortune to cross paths with a deeply disturbed man. As for the earthquakes, they continue to come and go as they have for millions of years, indifferent to human activity, driven by geological forces we understand scientifically, but still fear viscerally. California trembles, as it always has and always will, not because of blood spilled or withheld, but because of the restless movement of the earth below us. In the end, the true horror of the Richard Hayes case isn't the possibility that his delusions might contain some grain of truth. They don't. The horror is that a human mind can become so distorted that killing innocent people seems not only justified but necessary. The horror is that despite our advances in understanding mental illness, we still struggle to identify and help those whose perceptions have detached from reality before tragedy occurs. And perhaps the deepest horror is the recognition that the line between sanity and madness may be thinner than we care to admit, that under the right circumstances, the mind's desperate search for patterns and meaning can lead any of us into dark territories. Not to murder, certainly, but perhaps to beliefs and actions that, viewed from outside, might seem equally detached from reality. As I write these final words, the ground beneath me is still. For now, at least, California rests easy, its faults temporarily quiet. And Richard Hayes sits in his cell, waiting for the next tremor that will, in his mind, validate everything he believed and did. The fact that such tremors will inevitably come is both the foundation of his delusion and the tragedy of his existence. A man who gave himself wholly to preventing a natural phenomenon that no amount of blood could ever truly stop.